Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, already facing a staff shortage, there is now another position to fill at the New Orleans Police Department, and doing so might be contentious. Police Chief Shaun Ferguson's retirement raises questions about the mood and pressure inside the department and the proper way to select a successor. The turmoil comes during a week already made tense by several gunshot incidents around town and a heinous double murder in usually peaceful Covington. Sports provided some distraction, though negative for the Saints, but positive for the Pelicans. Joining us to discuss these stories are Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Thanh Truong, digital news reporter, WWL Radio; John Simerman, reporter, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate; and Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4. I'm going to go on over to John first. And big news this week, NOPD Police Superintendent Shaun Ferguson said he is retiring.
Yes, it was announced by the city on Tuesday. Chief Ferguson, after nearly 4 years in that post as the city's top cop, came out with the media, in front of the media on Wednesday, and did seem quite relieved after a very long 4 years. I don't think anybody was too surprised. There's been a lot of pressure on for him to go by the city council and some in the business community who've been pushing for that. He says he's retiring on his own accord for health and family reasons. But, you know, it's been in August under pressure from the business community mostly. The mayor brought in an outside team from New York City, consultants, former NYPD, to come in and really run the show at the police department. And try to deal with this manpower shortage and some of the other issues that Chief Ferguson has faced. He'll be gone December 22nd. We'll see who gets named his replacement, whether interim or permanent, and that's a big fight. I mean, this comes right as January 1 is approaching, and that's there's an ordinance that voters just passed that gives the city council power over those kind of decisions. And right now, the council is chafing at a possibility that the mayor will avert that process by naming somebody before then.
And what I found really interesting was that even the mayor's staunchest allies, Eugene Green, for example, who voted against the charter change, he nevertheless said the people have spoken. 60% of the electorate came out in favor of this charter change. Mm-hmm. He is urging the mayor to name the person after January 1st so it can go through the council vetting. They don't really, have the decision to name the person, but they have the decision to ask questions and vote for a confirmation, as you might see a president of the United States nominates and Senate votes. Right. They want that power.
Now you reported who the rumored person is, who the mayor might.
Jeanette Williams, who's a police captain now, a pretty quick rising police captain. She became a police captain last year. This is from sources, and it's been these sources say that the mayor has, for a while, wanted to name a black woman as police chief. Some of the options there have become more limited. One of the folks, Sabrina Richardson, who was a captain, has been demoted since, was considered kind of a leading candidate for that, if that were the case. And but she's now, under investigation. She's suspended for 4 months, so she's so Jeanette Williams is not a name that a lot of people are probably all that familiar with, although she was in the news section of NOPD and doing public affairs and that kind of thing early on.
I think what's going to be interesting is to whoever steps into this new position, and Mike and John, you know better than most, the biggest issue facing NOPD right now is manpower. Right. And I think there was a loss of faith and a lack of faith, especially in Ferguson being the right arm of Cantrell in managing the NOPD. Whoever comes in there next, I think there's a big question of can they rejuvenate and re-energize the rank and then pull in more officers, because whoever is leading this force, the biggest question, the biggest issue is going to be getting enough officers to win back not only the trust of the rank and file, but also the confidence of the public.
That's where leadership comes in, and you have the business community asking quite openly for a national search. Right. That doesn't usually happen in New Orleans in the selection of a chief, but they're trying to nudge the mayor to do that. She seems inclined not to. She looks like she's going to go in-house.
Well, during his press conference the other day, Chief Ferguson, when asked about that, he said, "Well, I can't name name anybody or the successor, but I feel confident that anybody, within the force would be able to do the job, or the leaders right now at NOPD." So that's the way he sees it. But like you said, the community leaders, many community and business leaders and members of the council are saying, we want a national search. Don't rush this because this is too important a job.
Former Police Chief Ronald Surpass was interviewed on WWL Radio during the week, and he's been a police chief in several different jurisdictions. He's seen the process, and he's seen national searches. And he said the only thing with national searches is they usually take like 49 months to complete. And then once you got somebody, then that person is just getting started. And so it's not a quick process.
No, and that leads to a lot of options for the mayor. She can name somebody now as an interim, and then wait until after January 1st and go through that council vetting process, or do the national search with an interim at the helm. Somebody's going to have to leave the department on December 22nd when Ferguson takes his last walk.
And so the consultants, do they stay on?
Now that's an interesting dynamic. Not only are they going to stay on, they are perceived as whoever's named, and if it is Jeanette especially, having a lot more influence. There's even talk of their contract being extended. They're here for 6 months. It looks like that's going to be extended for another 6 months. So there's talk of them being sort of a shadow police chief, or a chief whisperer, as it were.
Chief Ferguson was at the helm during a really challenging time for the department. I've heard some say even more challenging than post-Katrina because of this critical shortage. And basically you hear in comments about him as a person, as a man, a really, really good guy, a nice, good person, just in a really difficult situation.
Yeah, and I think there were, and John and Mike chime in, I think there were internal politics at play. I heard from, and I spoke with many former and current officers on and off the record. PIB, the Public Integrity Bureau, was sort of the wheel in which a lot of the what they call personal vendettas, but also personal issues, where they would kind of serve out some of these punishments, in some views, unjustly. The Cantrell administration replaced the head of PIB and changed that. I think it's going to...
Yeah, that was one of the recommendations of when Mayor Cantrell went to all the districts. The single thing she heard throughout all the 8 districts was the oppressive nature of PIB.
Yeah.
You had somebody there, Linda Westbrook, who had been there for more than 8 years,
Right.
which is way longer than the tenure of most PIB commanders. And notice how quickly there was a change to a new PIB commander, Keith Sanchez.
Yeah, I think the debate between outside or inside, that's always going to be prevalent in the NOPD at this point, because you will always have that staunch kind of core people and members who want to keep things local, and that's pretty much New Orleans as well, and how that's going to balance out with somebody from the outside.
And Errol, I know you wanted to talk also about how other places selected a police chief.
Yeah, well, there's no one perfect method. There have been 2 New Orleans police chiefs who were the product of a national search, and both of them were by the mayor's name, Morial. Dutch Morial did a national search, and they came up with a guy that was the police chief of Birmingham named Jim Parsons, and he came in. It was an interesting dynamic. It was the first time that you had a black mayor appointing a white police chief, but that probably at the time seemed good because you could have trust on both sides. And Parsons started off with a good reputation as a reformer. Things got bad when there was a nasty shooting incident in Algiers involving the police, and there were trials, and so his term didn't end successfully. But the other was Mark Morial, who did a national search. It was a long search too, and he came up with Pennington, who was a deputy chief in Washington. And Pennington was very, very popular at the time. New Orleans had about 400 murders a year, and he did a lot to curtail that. Now, some people say, well, the national trend was in his favor anyway, but he was a reformer. He was generally respected, so much that there was a movement for him to run for mayor.
Oh, he did run for mayor. He made the runoff.
He did, and he lost.
Now, remind you, he came in not so popular. Obviously, insiders and the deputy chiefs at the time thought, they should have gone in-house. So people were very wary, and he was someone who he didn't immediately, try to respond. You know, he was a little bit aloof, kept his own counsel, but he earned the trust, and he brought in those consultants at the time, John Linder, who's a consultant now, along with Jack Maple, super cop from New York. They came out with the Pennington Plan. This came out right after the city had reached the low point of 424 homicides in a single year, 1994. He promised to cut the murder rate in half, and he did that within 3 years by 1999.
Okay, so moving a little bit closer to more current time, some immediate past superintendents and how they've done.
And listen, I would just point out that it wasn't 2, but 3 who were selected after national search, because some people tend to overlook that Ronald Surpass was actually the product of a national search. Didn't quite seem like it because he had spent 20 years here. He was the deputy chief under Richard Pennington.
And this is during Mitch Landrieu?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And Mitch Landrieu made a big point of saying, we're going to get the best and the brightest. And they did bring in people from all over the country. At the time, Surpass was the police chief in Nashville, Tennessee. And he did go through, a very thorough vetting process and had to do rounds of interviews. And he came up as the top candidate. And the credentials don't lie. You know, he left New Orleans as the deputy chief and was the chief of police in Washington State, parlayed that into a successful stint in Nashville. So he can hold his own nationally.
But then he left in the middle of Mitch Landrieu's term and succeeded by
Michael Harrison.
Yeah, Michael Harrison was what was interesting is Ronald Surpass came in with much fanfare under Mitch Landrieu, and that soured very, very rapidly. It started with a freeze. I know there was a budget crunch, and there was a freeze of hiring across the board, and behind the scenes, Surpass was telling Mitch, you can't do that to the police pipeline. You need to keep academy classes going. You're going to dig a hole that is going to be very difficult to dig out of. Sure enough, Mitch did not take that advice. There was 2 full years without an academy class, and the police force started to erode, and it is a hole that the police department, it's much bigger now and has not been able to dig out. Very prophetic by Surpass at the time.
And then following Surpass was Michael Harrison, as you
Harrison,
said. And, by all accounts, really a very strong police superintendent.
He was homegrown. He was not one of the deputy chiefs. It was a little bit surprising to some people when he got named. He was the commander of the 7th District at the time. And he was somebody who was thought, oh boy, Ronald Surpass and Mitch Landrieu, both famous for having large egos and clashed, especially over that, hiring freeze. And then Michael Harrison was thought to be, maybe a little more amenable, had a softer side personality, was a lay pastor in his church. But he actually grew on the job, and we saw him grow independence. And by the end of his tenure, he was being sought after in other cities around the country, and ended up being the police chief in Baltimore, which is considered a step up to a bigger city.
And so he left when Mayor Cantrell came on board, and then she named.
And she named Shaun Ferguson, and once again another, homegrown product. Had only worked at the NOPD, born and raised New Orleanian, 9th Ward guy. He was another pick that did leave some people scratching their heads. He did not come from the deputy, chief ranks. Right. He himself had been a commander in a district in the 2nd. And people were sort of waiting for him to do a Harrison 2.0, to really grow into the position and sort of strike out. One thing that, and he was, as we mentioned, the police chief during perhaps one of the most difficult periods between COVID, you had the George Floyd, civil unrest, and the police department on personnel cratered, lost, nearly 400 officers, leaving him without many men on the chessboard to move around for crime fights.
So you put this in the context of the consent decree, the federal consent decree that the department's been under for a decade. Right. You look at Michael Harrison as someone who really embraced those reforms, was terrifically popular with the federal judge who matters most over that and over getting, the NOPD compliant to the point where federal oversight goes away. You see Ferguson as somebody who was kind of hired on to take that ball across the goal line for the mayor, which would have been an important part of her legacy, that is on shaky ground now. The federal judges pulled the brakes on that with all of this crime and all of the factors you're talking
They're
about.
not even
Definitely challenges ahead.
Right.
I'm going to have to move us on.
They're not even on
because
the
we're starting to run
2-year
out of time.
off-ramp of that. They've all actually gotten further away from getting out of the consent decree.
So definitely challenges ahead for whomever, and still challenges on how that's going to be named as whoever that person's going to be. So, all right, and you know, crime in New Orleans is a problem. Generally, we look at some of the outlying areas of New Orleans, you know, our suburbs or exurbs, to be more peaceful. Covington certainly being one of them, but Covington really was rocked, the entire community has been, by 2 brutal murders. And you covered the funeral of the priest who was murdered this week.
And just for the time's sake today, the second of the victims, one of 2 victims, was buried today, Ruth Pratt's. She was a 73-year-old grandmother. She and Father Otis were both victims of homicide. Father Otis was laid to rest on Monday, 1 week exactly from the time that their bodies were discovered behind a business in downtown Covington. According to investigators, burned beyond recognition. There is a man that is in jail right now in Angola after he tried to escape the St. Tammany Parish jail. He is 49-year-old Antonio Tyson. And the difficulty that many people have had in trying to wrap their head around any murder, but particularly this murder, is what happened, why were these victims targeted? And that's something that the parish of St. Peter Catholic Church has been wrestling with. And in covering that, what I noticed was the strength of the parish's community in the sense of faith, but also many people just spoke of Father Otis's personality and who he was. And by all accounts, he was a funny man from Mississippi with a funny accent. He was a good accountant. He came into the priesthood in the latter part of his life at 49 years old, and he was well beloved.
In your podcast for WWL Radio, you really do provide a pretty good, a wonderful portrayal, actually, of the character of Father Young, Otis Young, right? And they called him Father O, I think, over there. Very beloved, but you talk to parishioners and friends of the priest, and you really come away with a sense of better knowing the man. It's really a wonderful piece that you did, very warm.
Yeah, I appreciate you listening. And I think the one thing that struck me was standing outside of the church as people were filing in, I noticed how many children were going into the church. And I think that's a very difficult conversation that families must have had, because when you step back and you take a look at the role of a pastor, especially in a parish like St. Peter Catholic Church in Covington, he baptized children, he married couples. This is a person that was very integral in people's lives, as many pastors are in this widely Catholic-heavy community of New Orleans and greater New Orleans.
Well, I think the Covington police, fortunately, don't have many homicide investigations to do. But here they really seem to act quickly and with the expertise on this.
Yeah, it was very quick. I mean, the alleged crime happened with this suspect on a Sunday, and Monday they discovered the bodies. They had a press conference later that week. It was a very quick turnaround, but I think that one of the parochial vicars who used to serve under Father Otis told me Covington was very much like Mayberry to many people. And I think for all intents and purposes, when you're living on the South Shore and you're in New Orleans and you kind of see what's happening here, you do view things on the North Shore as very Mayberry-esque. He said that it seemed like the sense of innocence in Covington has been shattered. And considering the brutality of the crime, you can't blame them.
As for the quick, solving of the crime in an arrest, the detectives were aided tremendously by a hit and run involving one of the victim's cars, and they went straight to surveillance video and were able to, retrace the steps of the suspect and got a really pretty clear and convincing evidence to make that arrest.
Yeah. The one thing that I noticed that most of the folks that I spoke with at the funeral of Father Otis, they said, we don't want to talk about the suspect. We don't want to talk about the man that did this. We want to remember the people. And I think it's a delicate balancing act, especially when you're reporting on it. And what I found remarkable is that most of the people that I spoke with said, I know that Ruth Pratt and Father Otis were forgiving this man as he was doing this to them. And I spoke with the cantor at the church, and I said, that sounds like a hard ask to forgive in this moment. She said, well, it's hard to be a Christian. And I couldn't argue with her
Right.
But
in that setting.
This was not a robbery, right? It was just someone out wanting to do something.
The motive is murky, and even if you had a motive that could explain away why this crime took place, I don't think anybody would accept that it was a rational decision that would explain why this happened.
Still some unanswered questions, but bottom line, horrifying, heartbreaking, and really disconcerting, I know, for the residents of Covington.
Absolutely.
All right, Tom. Thanks a lot. Okay, while we're still talking about crime, let's go back over to Mike and shootings in the New Orleans area, in the city of New Orleans. I mean, we keep hearing about them, but there's really been a rash over the past couple of weeks. I mean, there were 5 victims in 3 days that were killed?
Well, 6 between Wednesday and Thursday, and I guess these were alarming beyond the shootings that we normally hear about in New Orleans, because they were in broad daylight. They were in busy, in front of the first one in front of a Walgreens at Legion Fields and Gentilly, and second on Thursday in front of a Dollar General, with a lot of business traffic in the middle of the day, obviously, vehicle traffic. It speaks to the brazenness of shooters. It does look like in both cases these were shooters looking for an intended target and not caring about collateral damage of any other bystanders, in the way it looks like in the first one on Wednesday in front of that Walgreens, a 17-year-old girl. We now find out with the coroner releasing her name that this happened on her 17th birthday.
Oh, that's
so
sad.
Quite tragic. Followed the next day, once again in a neighborhood in District D, where you don't see a lot of this, especially on those business corridors in front of the Dollar General, on Chef Mentor, with 4 people shot, a couple of people inside the store with bullets that pierced through the glass front door of that business. Clearly unintended targets there, and this has really raised the level of alarm that you could just be going about your business, shopping at a popular store, and you just don't know when those bullets are going to be flying.
You become a victim. That is just frightening.
I don't think we can disconnect what's happening on the street to what's happening at City Hall with NOPD. And I know there's a lot of attention being paid of who's going to be the next superintendent of NOPD, but most of the citizens, they're interacting and they want to interact with officers on the street, and I think that's the sense of security that needs to be restored or at least improved on the street level, because whoever leads the NOPD, what really is going to matter is the security that everyday citizens are going to feel when they're going to a Walgreens, when they're pumping their gas.
Right, whether they're driving their car during the interstate or any street for that matter.
Precisely, and I think that
and one thing that really helps boost public confidence are quick arrests. And in this case, we've seen no motive, no suspect. Obviously, they're just starting their investigations, looking at surveillance camera. We saw a couple of kind of grainy images in the Walgreens shooting. But again, when people feel, and we've seen this in New Orleans, their solve rate for homicide is way lower than the national average. And that leads people to think, well, those killers and would-be killers who may strike again are still out there.
Major challenges.
It's unnerving.
And certainly the new superintendent is going to face those challenges. Did you have something quickly to add, John?
Well, you do talk to people who are family members of victims of recent murders who have seen the suspects or the people they suspect, in the community still out there. And that sort of breeds that kind of, nothing's going to be done.
Under concern. Okay, I'm going to change the subject now. Something kind of happy, and we can't talk that long on it, I'm afraid. E, it's over to you. Pelicans are doing well.
Well, it's halfway happy. Okay, the Saints broke everybody's heart last Monday night, dropping a 13-point lead and losing, technically still in contention for the playoffs, but not.
To be fair, it was probably Tom Brady that broke the heart.
Yeah. That was bad too. So there have been many times when the Saints have broken our hearts in January. They get into the playoffs. At least we get the heartbreak over in early December, and so we can enjoy the rest of the season.
Considering the state of the NFC South, where everyone's under 500, maybe we're getting put out of our misery sooner rather than later.
Okay, let me get you to talk basketball real quick.
Yeah, well, the Pelicans in first place in the Western Division, and so they're a real contender into the finals. And the second place team is the Phoenix Suns, and through a quirk in the schedule, which I don't remember, they're playing Phoenix twice this weekend at home, Friday night and Sunday night. And so by the time this weekend over, they can really have maybe really dug in the first place or be in second place again.
All right.
And remember, Chris Paul plays for the Phoenix Suns. So.
Okay, well, go Pels. All right, E, other stories. Y'all real quick on this.
Okay, the police chief takes what's called his final walk on December 22nd. It's a tradition among police chiefs that they're going to throw out Gallier Hall. I'm not sure where it walks to, but a lot of citizens and public leaders are being invited to join the final walk.
On the 22nd, is that what you said?
December 22nd, yeah.
Okay, Tan, over to you.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing, obviously, who's going to be the next police superintendent, but the level of confidence that he or she might exact from the rank and file and how many more officers they can bring to the force.
Big story, big concern.
Fouad Zitan, who is a big political benefactor for local elected officials, was indicted yesterday along, a co-conspirator named in the indictment is a New Orleans Police Department officer who's accused of helping him get fraudulent police reports to get insurance money for artwork that wasn't stolen that he was supposedly claiming was. And we'll follow that for a while.
Okay, kind of clear that up for us. Good. Mike, over to you.
Well, Karen Carter-Peterson, who pled guilty to charges related to her gambling problem, was supposed to be sentenced this week. That was continued to an odd date. Usually you see the courts taking time off during the holidays, but she's going to be sentenced on December 28th in federal court.
Okay, and just a couple of seconds left here. I forgot to ask you guys, the mayor, has she indicated at all what she's going to do regarding the superintendent?
No,
Not directly.
Quiet. We're all kind of like reading the tea leaves and monitoring sources. Now people are talking to her, encouraging her to wait until after that January 1st charter change, but so far no indications that that's going to happen.
Okay, we'll find out. Thanks a lot for being here, guys. Thank you all for joining us too, and we will see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.